Hello, welcome everyone to the City Council Planning, Development, and Environment Committee of September 6th. My name is Victoria Hunt, and I'm joined tonight with Council President Walsh and Council Deputy President Hall. We have multiple public comment opportunities at tonight's meeting. There will be a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, or you can make comments after the presentation and council question and answer period on tonight's two agenda items. And we will start with public comment. Members of the public may address council at this time in person or virtually, and I will check in with the city clerk if there is anybody online who looks like they might want to make comment.
Chair Hunt, we currently have no virtual attendees.
All right, thank you very much. Then I will mention that as a reminder, written comments can be submitted at any time to citycouncil@issaquah.gov. And with that, we will go to our first item, which is approval of the minutes. We have minutes from the June 6th meeting. Do we have any concerns or edits about approving those? Not seeing any. I would move to approve the minutes of June 6th. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Great. Then we will go on to our first item of the evening, which is ID 1404, Comprehensive Plan Update, Housing and Land Use. And this will be presented by Kristen Leeson, Senior Planner. Kristen, please take it away.
There we go. Good evening. I am Kristen Leeson, Senior Planner with Community Planning and Development, and we are talking about the housing element update for part of the 2024 Periodic Comprehensive Plan Update. There we go. So our purpose tonight is for you all to provide input on the first draft of the housing element. Direction needed. Just consider these things throughout the presentation. Are there any additional considerations that the Planning Policy Commission should study prior to finalizing their recommendation to the City Council? Do the proposed changes fully meet the expectations for the housing element update? And are there any additional topics for staff to consider when making our final edits to the draft? And I'm going to ask as well, it's not on here, but is there any additional information that you all might need in order to make a decision? So a little background, as you know, all the elements in the comprehensive plan set the intent, the vision, the goals, and it guides implementation through our land use code, such as the development standards, architectural standards, and affordable housing. Also through our housing strategy plan, which is scheduled to be updated after the housing element is done, so that we know we're headed in the right direction with that. And lastly, through the city's strategic plan. It is monitored currently through just our housing report annually, also requiring updates and sort of report cards to the state every 5 years. So it'll be monitored through that as well. As a reminder, our housing targets were adopted in the King County countywide planning policies. Our housing target for 2019 to 2024 is 3,500 new units. 89% of those are expected or are being asked to be affordable housing, anywhere from 120% AMI, area median income, on down through zero through 120 area median income, which leaves about 363 of our units to be at market rate. Our largest, just over 2,500 of our units that we need are at 50% AMI and below. So tonight I'm going to run this through new policy first and then amended policies that seem to work with our Planning Policy Commission. New policies can be found in the Housing Supply and Character section, Housing Affordability and Results and Accountability. And amended policies can be found in all of those sections. We'll look at those. Starting with the new housing policy. The goal there is to achieve a variety of neighborhoods, housing types, and densities throughout the city. The first one is to have higher density and more diverse housing in the regional growth center. This is both a state and a county requirement that we include this. We had something similar to it, particularly in the land use element, but not in the housing element, so we've added that. Number two is to develop regulations that prioritize the needs of the cost burdened And again, that's a state and county requirement. And you also received as part of this packet some background information and census data on cost burden. So we're going to go back and look at that, and we'll elaborate on that in our element. We just got that information on Thursday, so we need to incorporate it. 3 is to remedy historical inequities in and expand access to home ownership opportunities, and that is for all, not just affordable housing, but for all, a state and county requirement. So moving on to, actually, I'll step back. Are there any questions? Do you want me to run through it, or do you want to ask questions after each section? Should have asked in the beginning.
We can just keep going.
Just keep going. Okay, thank you. So moving on to a housing affordability, the goal is to, we've changed this just a little bit, realize affordable ownership and rental opportunities throughout the city for households of all economic segments of the community. And policy number 4 is to prioritize affordable units at 50% and below. The state's requirement is 30% and below, but as I said, our target 2,500 for those units are 50% and below. But just to ensure, I checked with the county and this meets their requirements, so we're covered. Number 5 is emergency housing, to allow for emergency housing, emergency shelters, and permanent secured housing. That is the requirement of House Bill 1220, which was adopted in 2021. Number 6 is to amend regulations that present barriers to equitable housing distribution, and that is a state and housing county, that is a state and requirement, and it just means that don't disallow affordable housing in places. Don't disallow smaller units in some places where, or only single family units in some places. So that's what that is. Number 7, reduce barriers to ownership at 80% and below. And number 8, mitigate displacement from large-scale investment, market pressure, and land use decisions that are made. So just ensure that if a big mall comes in, it's not knocking out a whole lot of homes and people are going to be displaced. Next section is results and accountability, and this is a whole new goal. Ensure comprehensive plan goals and policies are accompanied by effective implementing regulations, programs, and funding. A lot of new ones here. One is, as I mentioned, the 5-year evaluation of regulations required by the. Another is a 5-year update of the housing strategy work plan. That's city new goal policy. 11, identify gaps in partnerships and resources, that's state and county. And the last one is our annual, we did not have this in there before, is with the annual report card, including that. On to housing policies. Our first one is B1, maintain adequate land supply to meet the needs. We did not have very specific countywide planning policies in place before. There was a general goal. We said, let's do that. So we just are specifying the King County planning policies. Allow and promote a variety of housing, that's state and county. And there we just amended it a bit. Adopt regulations to maintain character. We just simply require realm. It's consistent with the land use code length. That is in there, just the word public realm. Allow flexibility in standards. We just made this more actionable and we needed to clarify it a bit. And I should change that because we've amended this since PPC and it no longer says allow flexibility in standards. It talks about reevaluating standards. A6, higher density housing near commercial centers. We actually deleted this one because it was repetitive with the new one that we put above. Still under housing supply, environmentally sensitive areas and sustainability, energy efficiency. This is addressed in the land use element, so we deleted it. We also deleted A10, it's repetitive. ADUs for ALM used for a variety of densities, we just clarify. B3, support development and preservation near transit. It's a state and county requirement, and the part that was required by them. B2, strategies to address affordability and special needs. We just made that more actionable. Goal C, encourage affordable housing through incentives and regulations. That was repetitive in the policy, so we just made it all a goal. Avoid disproportional impacts. offer incentives for development and preservation. Those are both state and county, and prioritize affordable housing on surplus land. We just made that actionable. And I should say at PPC, or at one point we were asked, it shouldn't just say make it for all surplus land, but it does say in our policy that if it's appropriate, then make it a priority for affordable housing, surplus land. Special needs housing goal, achieve housing opportunities for residents with disabilities or other special housing needs. The only one under here was that we simplified D6 to say encourage accessible housing for those with disabilities. Regional resources, cooperate with other jurisdictions to address the region's housing needs. And these were all just simplified and clarified. And then the state and county here is where we did actually refer just to the 30% and under. We said work with local, regional, and national resources for 30% and under AMI households. That one we did specify the 30%. And for results and accountability, we just amended to ensure regulations exist to implement goals and policies. And we actually got rid of that one and combined it with the former goal, make a new goal, former policy to make a new goal. The overall schedule, we'll work on revising this. And in Q4, we're going to have a second draft available. We'll take it to Planning Policy Commission. In January, we send our entire draft to the state for review. In Q1 of 2024, we will review the elements, and then in Q2, we'll have a public hearing, and then it comes to council after that. As far as this committee's next steps, in October, you're going to see the draft land use element, and then you get to see me again. And then in November, you will see the environment stewardship and climate resilience element, which is the new one required by the state. And then in November, you'll also look at the SEPA scope, the review for the SEPA scope. And that's all I have. So if you have any questions.
Council President?
Yeah, just a quick question on it. Does the order of the policies matter? Is there any sense of ranking of importance?
Not yet. Well, no. So as far as the sections go, no. As far as categories go, we will try and place those together, but there's no ranking of importance. It's all important. We just want to get similar categories, similar policies together.
So how do we address things that are potentially conflicts?
So
I'll give an example. The A2 refers to diversity of housing types. X1 refers to increasing and density, but then A1 talks about maintaining neighborhood character and scale. And so if potentially density is a change to neighborhood character and scale, how do we utilize those?
So if you allow a fourplex in a single family neighborhood, that fourplex can look like a single family house. You can have one door that enters, you can have a stairwell that goes upstairs, and you've got 4 units, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top, and it can look like a single family house. So they don't conflict, they can work together.
So how do we make a judgment where that line is?
That would come in with the development regulations.
Okay, so not something necessarily with the comprehensive plan,
No.
but at a different point. So we can discuss that somebody might read these things as conflicting, but we feel comfortable enough that any clarification that we make on developer regulations makes it so that we understand how those all work together.
Yes. One of the things on our upcoming work plan just allowed for cottage housing, but we don't have development regulations for cottage housing. So we actually have to work on those development regulations to make sure that they don't mess up the character of their surrounding neighborhood. So yeah, it's doable. It's completely doable.
Okay, and so if I'm thinking about how this all ranks together, the comprehensive plan, if we say our priorities and our goals include things like increasing density increasing housing diversity and maintaining neighborhood character and scale, then the developer regulations are what are developed and utilized as a way to make those happen.
Yes,
Okay. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Do we currently have micro units as a housing type available in Issaquah?
They're non-constructed, but we just approve those as a permitted use in the urban core and multi.
So there are, but there are none.
There are none yet.
Yep.
No.
Okay, thank you. Do you have questions?
A couple of follow-ups based on the questions that I sent to you earlier today, and thank you for the quick reply on that. One of them was on A4 under neighborhood character, which I think we took out the reference to transit in that. But you had said transit was covered in some other ones. That one had to do more with character of the building type. So you're thinking, let me just go to A4. Yeah, having to do with contribution to the public realm, such as focal places, connections to entrances, so on and so forth, and access to transit was removed. And my question was, is there value in kind of keeping something like that, like something like transit?
It's access to transit is mentioned in two other policies that actually refer to more of the location of it, and this has to do with neighborhood character. And access to transit is not necessarily neighborhood character. This is more the site and making sure that things blend together in scale.
Okay.
And
So then including it in those other two places would achieve our goal.
yes.
Our goals, essentially. Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Then the other one was A12, which had to do with the reinvestment for affordable housing and whether or not we want to keep something like reinvestment where necessary. I'm curious where you.
Yeah, and that's, as I mentioned, that is actually one of the policy considerations in our housing strategy work plan. Yet, when I went back here, by taking out the words reinvestment, that takes away the guidance for the housing strategy work plan. So yes, I agree, we should either put the words reinvestment back in there or create a new policy where it stands out on its own.
Oh, okay, so something like that will show up in the next
Yes.
draft. Okay.
Because that was a good point.
Understood. And then the only thing that I thought might be like an interesting addition and wanted your opinion on was whether we wanted to add some policy about looking into kind of emerging practices in affordable housing planning and other buzzword that I said, innovative approaches. Is that something that you think would fit well in the comp plan housing element or maybe live somewhere else?
No, I think it could. We've had it in other elements before, and housing is, I hate to say it, it's kind of such a hot topic right now, but but it's not going away. It's important. And so absolutely, and it could go under the monitoring section. And, because if we often do update this annually and we can say, update as needed, follow those and add those as needed.
Thank you very much. The other ones were more just kind of clarifying for my understanding. So those were...
Okay.
Great. Any more questions? Okay. So at this time, we would normally also call for public comment. I will note that there are no members of the public in attendance. And City Clerk, do we have anyone in the virtual meeting?
Yes, Chair Hunt, we do have a virtual attendee. Give them a moment to raise their hand if they'd like to speak.
Okay. I have some,
No virtual hands raised.
no virtual hands. Okay. All right. Then we will move into our discussion on this item, and we do have several questions that are posed for us by the administration that are on the screen. Would anyone like to start us off?
Well, it sounds like some of the questions that I asked might lead to updates. So I guess I'd be interested if planning policy has any thoughts on those. You know, I think the second question is hard for me to answer. I'm not sure what my expectation should be, the housing element. I wonder if I could maybe frame that more as a question. In previous major comp plan updates, what has been, you know, the expectation of council going into it? Because it does seem like a lot of these are very high level, some conflict, like was mentioned, and you're really supposed to use it for then kind of more implementation plans, like we have the housing strategy work. So how should we be thinking about expectations?
I think, and I think it would be looking at, and you're probably going to need more time with this question, because I think it's looking at our background information and what the city has, what we're missing, where we're off a little bit, and that our updates should be based on that. And so are we filling those gaps that are discussed in the background information? So I'll give you some slack on that one. Maybe we can talk.
Well, no, that's very helpful. And I
Okay.
think the only other
But-
thing I would say for this question too is one of my expectations would be that we comply with county and state regulations. So, oh, sorry, I'll move this closer. That we comply with county and state regulations, and it seems like we're doing that. So we're meeting that expectation. And then other topics to consider. Again, a few of the things came up when I was asking questions, and I'm not there. We'll kind of look into those. So that's my feedback.
Mr. President?
Yeah, so I think on the expectations portion of things, I expected by this point that we would at least know when we were having conversations about the state bills, particularly 1110, and how we want to address them. Because there's the obvious, you know, just count our allowance of ADUs and, you know, make that a minimum requirement. But I feel like the comp plan is an appropriate time to be able to have a larger conversation about what does it mean to maintain neighborhood scale within the context of having more housing diversity, increasing density, and not just complying with the state law, but making it work for the city of Issaquah. So I understand there's a whole lot we still need to get from Department of Commerce, and that the idea of moving forward and having a conversation without that legal interpretation is difficult. It just feels like the comprehensive plan is the time when we should be able to incorporate that conversation. So I'm having a lot of conflicts about how can we potentially have some of those discussions about what that looks like. As someone who lives in the Highlands, we have a lot of diversity of housing up there. And so if a few single family houses were to change over to courtyard apartments, that fits within the scale and character of the neighborhood. Whether that's the same in different neighborhoods, obviously isn't necessarily the case, but you talked about developer regulations as a way to maybe make that work through. So I guess I'm just having a little bit of conflict about those ideas. Yeah. You looked like you were going to say something. Oh, I go to Wally or?
Well, I was just going to add that, if you take 4 steps back of what comprehensive plans were to be, and most states have some version of this, it's supposed to be a local document. In Washington state and in other states, state legislatures, county governments have taken a lot of that flexibility away from cities. And so rather than having the comp plan be a thoughtful community dialogue as to how you want to see your own community develop, it has now become, here's all the state laws and all the county regulations that have passed, which we now need to conform to. And so then we are faced to incorporate all that in order to be in compliance with state law. but then also to say, oh gosh, what does this mean for us? So the very nature of comprehensive planning in many states, and I won't pillar Washington State specifically, has changed dramatically because state legislatures are now telling local governments that this is a issue of statewide concern and take a lot of the options away. And so that makes it harder. So people like Kristen, then when this is all done and all the things we have on the whiteboard list of things and policies, all that now has to be incorporated with this new plan, some of which is reacting to state law that passed, what, less than 6 months ago, then a couple of years back, other laws. So it makes the role of a local housing planner nearly impossible and makes the role of a local city council member impossible. Because you're absolutely right. What does it mean? And how do we deal with this? And shouldn't this be a time for thoughtful reflection and deciding how we're going to do this? But instead, the state legislature and the county have taken a lot of that away. So we're left to scramble to see how all these pieces that have been created by others fit together. And so I know that the council separately is concerned about all the things that happened through Title 18 because, of course, we had the bonus of doing all of that before we started the comp plan. So this council's talked a lot about housing policy. I think the real challenge is how do we make these square pegs fit into not necessarily round holes, but rectangular holes and oblong holes. And I think you have every right to be kind of frustrated and scratching your head as to how this all lines up. But we are at the mercy of the state legislature and the county who have said our opinions count more than local city council. And that makes your job really much harder.
So I think one of the points that you made there was, what does this mean? What does this look like in the city of Issaquah? And I think that is really what I would like to be able to get to, is how do we thoughtfully implement 1220 and 1110 within the city, and what does that look like from a comprehensive plan goal?
And I don't know that the comprehensive plan is necessarily the vehicle. Maybe it was at one point because I think the dynamics were more straightforward, but the dynamics have become so complex that we now have to layer on top of that a whole other level of policy discussion. Because you've just mentioned 2 or 3 things. You put your Title 18 review hat on, there's another at least half dozen things.
Yeah.
Parking and setbacks and all the environmental issues that we want to consider. So now, Kristen and her colleagues have to lay all this out on the table and say, how really does this fit together? And try to come back into the council with recommendations as to how this fits together. And then, on top of all that, who's actually going to come put money on the table to do any of this? To comply not only with what the state and the county has said, but also then what the desires of the local elected officials are. So I think your frustration is very appropriate. I just don't think this is the place. And I think what we have called the whiteboard becomes sort of a housing planning, not the report card so much, although probably it ends up, I mean, from a functional perspective, we will roll all this together. As Kristen has said, once this is done, we'll come out with these housing policies, and I guess that will be the local vehicle that will line up all these things. And then we'll come back to you with that, and that will be the vehicle in which we try to accomplish some of this. But the element, the housing element.
And our strategy as well. And I think too, consider this, think about this when I bring the land use element back, because that does hit a little of our local issues more because of the hillsides and the environmental concerns that we have and how we protect those even when you increase density. So that comes in a little bit into the land use element as well. And this is more about the housing itself, not how it looks or where it sits. And the land use element addresses that a little bit more. So the external concerns are laid out a little bit more there.
Yeah. So let me then just put a finer point on, we haven't made any decisions and interpretations on what 1110 looks like in the city of Issaquah, but I'm looking at these concepts of housing diversity, density, and maintaining scale, and feeling like there could be some conflict there. So I think the question that I would ask potentially PPC to look at is, do they feel like there's a conflict? And if so, in order to forward what we want as a community and maintain state, fitting the state requirements, does maintaining scale still exist as a priority? So that would be one thing. I've got another, but do you want me to go on, or?
Well, I think I will second that. I felt like reading this, that the character, because it can be interpreted lots of ways. And we actually grappled with this, I think, in some of our earlier, in documents that we worked on earlier as a council, that character is often meant to be the scale or the look of the outside exterior look of the building, but that isn't what is necessarily what comes to mind for everybody when they read neighborhood character. And so I think it leaves room for the conflict between the different sections, because we talk a lot about the ways in which we want there to be change to better meet the housing needs of the community, and then also maintaining in the same state. So I think I interpreted there as some conflict as well. So I just wanted to say, I think I also felt that tension, and I also think that's something for planning policy to look at. And I think one step that could take us in the right direction would be to clarify that we are talking about scale and exteriors of buildings and that sort of thing, specifically when we're talking about character, and maybe reduce or eliminate character as a sort of fuzzy and potentially conflicting term.
So the other thing that I just wanted to talk about, having been on the King County Affordable Housing Committee, and we're doing a lot of talking about what the monitoring looks like. I would ask staff to think about whether we want to take that 5-year check-in as a point to potentially make changes, and considering that one of the concepts at the county level and the Affordable Housing Committee was, is the AHC going to provide feedback to the cities about, like, did you hit your targets, or, did you implement all of the things that you wanted to? So I would consider adding something about, like, and make modifications if recommended. So I'd just like staff to think that over. I'm not saying it necessarily is the right way, but it gives us an option to really think ahead about how we maintain this document.
Can I ask a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
So the question on your earlier point, Council President, the question for PPC, I'm just trying to understand that then, would be, are you seeing that this conflict exists here as well? And if so, does it need to be addressed in the housing element of the comp plan and not necessarily in some interpretation of the housing element?
Yeah, and I think Councilmember Hunt's point of neighborhood character being kind of a terminology that could be used to say keep apartments out, or something else like that, may be the way that just the part that needs to change in order for the rest of that to be able to be accomplished through developer regulations. So just having a conversation about, is there a conflict, and if so, how do we address that so that our neighborhoods can change as needed to address the housing need, but maintain I don't know what the words are, but probably scale, and see what that is. So
Yeah, I think it was in our discussions about Old Town that we felt like it was important to really clarify what we meant by that term, and that helped. Do you have anything additional? Okay. So I have a couple of specific things. First one, I'll start with a question. So H policy C6, is the one about, which has changed a little bit, is now says prioritize affordable housing on surplus city-owned land if it is suitable for housing, with a preference for housing for low-income and very low-income households. Do we have policy language that clarifies what prioritize means somewhere else?
No.
Okay. So it did get a little bit simpler from the earlier version, which was consider giving priority to. But I still think prioritizing affordable housing on surplus city-owned land, especially because this is something for the city to be doing, I think it would be helpful for us to understand more what the actions or policies would be that would support that action.
Yeah, actually, I wonder, so that came up, I read the same question about what does prioritized mean in the minutes for PPC, and then I asked a similar question too. So I wonder if PPC might consider, and staff, of course, might consider whether to define some of those words that are used frequently, so the reader kind of understands exactly what the intent of a specific. Do you think that would help, Councilmember Hunt?
It could. I think I would want to know what policies we're contemplating that would prioritize affordable housing. So it's a pretty specific, in this case, a pretty specific ask. But if it came up for in other places, then there are probably other places where it could be clarified as well. Okay, so that's another thing that we would like PBC to take another look at. Okay, H policy D1, I think. So this one didn't change, but H policy D1 allows small-scale group homes, foster care facilities, and other special needs housing in all residential areas of the city while maintaining the character of the neighborhoods. I don't think we need to add while maintaining the character of the neighborhoods there. There are many other places where it says we want to make sure we meet the needs of different communities, different people within the community, and we don't specifically say while maintaining the character. So I felt like we should just strike that.
Could you please clarify which policy that was?
It's H policy D1. It's the first one of special needs housing. It did not change in this review, okay. So it's former language.
Found it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so this is a bit of a technicality, but I think it is meaningful. So H policy A12, it says encourage reuse of appropriate buildings to maintain community character and preserve diverse and affordable housing opportunities such as microunits and single room occupancy housing. Since we don't have any microunits, I thought this needs to be not that we preserve and maintain that kind of housing, but that we're actually incentivizing or promoting the encouraging development of that if we want it, because currently there is nothing to preserve.
So I interpret that one as if there is a building that could be reused as is rather than being torn down, potentially reuse it as microunits or single room occupancy. So I don't think that requires you're not saying preserve single room occupancy housing, you're saying preserve the building. So I think that one's okay. It's just saying maybe these are ways that you could use an existing building.
Okay. I think then in that case, maybe it can be reorganized to clarify that. But good catch. The last thing was on Council Deputy President Hall's comments on keeping up with new trends and new affordable housing. I think there's a section that would be a good place for that, which is in the, let's see. There's sort of a section where we're reviewing standards, and it's around the policy C3, C4 section. But also, like, C4 is about considering ways to utilize transfer of development rights, and C3 is reviewing construction standards. So maybe somewhere in there where there's reviewing the financial incentives or structures that are in place in other communities that are generating more affordable housing. That was my list.
Anything you've heard tonight in terms of feedback that concerns you in any way?
I don't think so. No.
You know, my only concern, members of the committee, I think asking PPC to define the word prioritization is a big ask. The way I heard it was a generic definition. You know, perhaps from a contextual perspective, that's a better charge to them. But to say we want to know what their definition of prioritization is, I mean, that just seems like a very different.
I actually started rewording it in my head, but not a definition of prioritize, but just for that specific policy, actually.
Okay, just to clarify, because I think that's still a big charge, but it's a much more doable charge than the term as it might apply to other parts of comprehensive. So if you're okay with charging them just as far, I think it was the surplus public property. That's still a large ask, but it's better than prioritization at large. What would you like?
I think Chair Hunt might be right. I mean, that one seems kind of particularly grayer than some of the other prioritized that I saw. You know, I think you had defined it in one of them as put at the top of the list, when possible. So, I mean, that's kind of like a generally acceptable standard definition of prioritize anyway. So, yeah, maybe that one is more grayer and just needs, and maybe it's not that PPC needs to come up with a definition, but asking them, do you agree that this needs to be further defined by staff or something like that? I don't know. Does that strike you in any way, Councilmember Hunt?
So the reason I asked the question is because I would like to know what policies would be, like what specific policies we would use, what tools we would use to achieve this. And prioritize in itself isn't an action. So I think for me it was more just like how do we make this actionable? You know.
Is that more like an evaluation criteria?
Well, so it says prioritize affordable housing on surplus city-owned land. There's not currently I mean, so is that saying attempt to?
Well, is that a means to the end? Is by having some sort of evaluation criteria, is that how you would prioritize? With a designated criteria? I mean,
Yeah, I
for
mean,
example,
I think that's
how much money is the
top of
city
the
going to
list.
lose
Yeah.
by subsidizing that? Is there a per unit property's worth $10 million and you're going to get 20 units of housing? You know, is that cost ratio component of prioritization?
And when we talked about this internally, actually, and, you know, if you look at, you know, there's maybe vacant King County land that's at the intersection of East Lake Sammamish and I-90. Probably not the best use for housing right there in an industrial area, but something located in the MUR or over closer to Old Town, something like that would be more likely appropriate for housing. So when we talked about it internally, that's where our heads went. Is it, and I think it says in the policy if, in the policy it says if appropriate for housing.
So that would be a zoning criteria.
Yes, yeah.
Which is hopefully the least subjective criteria we got.
Okay. So I don't think, to meet my intent, I don't think we need to have them work through the word prioritize, because it's used in a bunch of other contexts as well, more, and in some cases also just about how community engagement is performed and making sure that you have voices in those conversations. And so I don't think we need to, I think I understand in those cases how it's being used. It was really in this case, like, if we don't have a policy already that is supporting this prioritization of affordable housing on surplus city-owned land, then really what is this meant to encourage us to be doing? So we could get clarity on that. That would meet my intent.
So I agree, we probably don't need to define prioritize. But what I think this brings up as a point for me is, yes, on specifically the city one, understanding how we would implement it is important, but maybe just take a glance over the other ones with prioritize and make sure that there are either examples or such as, or, you know, something that gives a clue how you would prioritize. Might be a way to address that.
Yeah, so actually, H policy X4, it says prioritize the need for housing affordable to households at or below 50% AMI through land use regulations, incentives, programs, and partnerships. So that one, it says prioritize, but then it explains what we could do. Criteria. The criteria? Yeah. Okay, do we have anything else? Okay, do you have what you need from us on this item?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you so much. With that, we will go to our second and final item, which is ID 1528, amendments to Title 18, Development Table Update, and this is presented by Valerie Porter, Associate Planner. Welcome, Valerie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Valerie Porter, and I'm an associate planner with the Community Planning and Development Department. So I'm here to discuss a code amendment to revise tables in Title 18 that has the potential to impact development. Direction needed. So staff would like to know if Council Committee agrees with the proposal to revise the zoning tables and if Council Committee has any feedback on the proposal. So before I get into the proposed changes, I'd just like to mention that with Title 18, some mistakes were made. And so this proposal is basically just kind of addressing some of those errors. And so we're basically converting the code back to what it was prior to the big land use code update. So the first, so we're going to be amending two tables. And so the first table is the form and intensity table that outlines building setbacks, lot coverage, height, density requirements, or density standards. The proposed change is shown in red, and we'd be adjusting the density standard from 36 units per acre to limited by far ratio. And this would change this standard for mixed use residential, intensive commercial, and village residential zones. All of these zones are located within the central Issaquah sub-area, and they can be seen here on this map. So some issues that were identified. So as it stands right now, the form and intensity table conflicts with the table of permitted uses, which identifies what uses are allowed in what zones. So for instance, housing is not allowed in intensive commercial, but because we have this standard, it's now requiring residential in that area, which creates this conflict. We also discovered that this requirement, This density standard is pretty difficult for some lots in these zones to comply with, especially for small lots, so it has the potential to prevent development, which is the opposite of what we want right now. So again, to resolve some of these issues, the administration is recommending revising the density table to have the density determined by the floor area ratio, as it was prior to the land use code update that recently happened. And then we'd also be relocating that 36 unit per acre requirement in the same chapter as the table in my next slide. So the second table that we would be amending is the floor area ratio standards table, and this regulates the building floor area relationship to the site that it sits on. So currently, the floor area ratio standards, also known as FAR, they're not listed for the mixed-use residential zone. So this proposed change, again, which is shown in red, would add the FAR standards back to the table, which was unintentionally omitted. Also, during the Title 18 update, in an effort to try to simplify things, we believe that a footnote that was originally in the Central Issaquah Development Design Standards was mistakenly included into the form and intensity table as that density standard. And so, but we still want to make sure that that footnote is being captured, because it really only applies to the urban core zone. So to make sure that that's captured, we'd be adding it as a standard right under the table. So again, some immediate issues if the code remains as is. There would be no standards for the mixed-use residential zone. So this would be the only zone within Central Issaquah that doesn't have any standards. And so it has the potential for future development to be out of proportion with the lot as well as surrounding development. And so because we're also proposing to insert that 36 unit requirement, that again ensures that it's going to be captured in the code, but that's also where we want that higher level of density, which is in that urban core zone. And again, if we don't have this in the code, then we're not going to get the level of density that we want where we want it. So the proposal is to, the administration is recommending amending table mixed zones, forms, and intensity minimum standards to change the zoning standards, and adding the mixed-use residential zoning standards to the table mixed zones floor area ratio FAR standard. So again, the administration is wanting to know if council committee agrees with the proposal and if you guys have any feedback. And should you agree with the proposal, the issue would be reviewed at the next city council meeting, which will be September 18th. And that concludes my presentation. Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you. Any questions?
Chair Hunt.
Yeah.
Sorry. Never mind.
So I guess I have a question. So were there intended to be policy changes to this section of code, or was it intended to be the same, but then in the reorganization it got, the footnote got lost and that?
Yeah, we were not making any changes to the zoning tables. It was basically trying to merge multiple documents in different formats together. And again, I think in an effort to try to simplify things, someone thought that that footnote applied to all zones when really it just applied to one zoning location. So no, we had no intention to do that.
Okay. And then has this gone by legal review like
Yes.
the rest of Title 18? Okay.
Yes, the city
Thank you.
attorney has reviewed this multiple times.
Okay, thank you. Those were my two questions. Do you have any other questions? Okay. All right, then I will check in if there are any members. There are still no members of the public in council chambers. I will check in with city clerk if there are any members of the public in the virtual meeting.
Chair Hunt, we have no virtual attendees.
Great. Then we will give any comments that we might have, Council President.
Super clear. Thank you guys for catching it. Appreciate it. Gives us an opportunity to do what we want. Yeah, I really appreciate how clear the information is on this is why it happened, this is what the effect is, this is how we're changing it, and here's what we expect as a result. So, answered all of my questions. Thank you.
Yes, well said. I agree. Thank you for catching this. Thank you for clarifying why it needed to be corrected and for making the correction. Seems pretty straightforward. So I agree. This should be changed, and I think it doesn't ask specifically if this should go on consent, but I would recommend that this go on consent. Do you have what you need on this item?
I do. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. All right, then that concludes our second of two items. Do we have any announcements? All right, then there being no further business, this meeting is adjourned at 7:26 p.m. Thank you all.